So this is the 40 marker we're going to look at today. So evaluate the view. Tells me it's most likely will be a debate. Evaluate the view that ethnic inequality, this is a 40 marker for Strat, so it will be under the compulsory section of the paper. Evaluate the view, because it's got the word view, it tells me it's going to be a debate. So I'm going to insert 6 paragraphs, 3 for and 3 against. If it was saying explanations, I would number 6 paragraphs down the page as a starting point. So evaluate the view. So I do 6, 3 for, 3 against. The ethnic inequality is caused by racism. So because it's got ethnic inequality, instantly it tells me I need to go straight to the green ethnic inequality grid for stratification. So I've just identified it's a debate, and then it tells me it's ethnic inequality, so I go straight to that grid in my brain, obviously, because I don't have it in the exam, and then I plan from there what to include. So this side is the ethnic inequality is caused by racism. And against, I think it's really helpful to do this, by the way, so it becomes really clear, and then I'll double check it, and yeah, so I'm nice and confident. Ethnic inequality is caused by racism, and then against is it's not racism, it's other factors. So, and then I'll read the question again. Evaluate the view. Yep, definitely telling me it's a debate. The ethnic inequality is caused by racism. This side is always for the question. So this side is racism. This side is no, against. So in the ethnic inequality grid for power and stratification, when I'm kind of working my way through it, what I note is that really when I look at Weberian and Barron and Norris, they talk about the dual labour market, arguing that actually it's sexism and racism that denies women and people of colour and women who are of colour access to the primary market. So I'm going to put Weberian here. So ethnic inequality is caused by racism. So Weberian, I'm going to do Barron and Norris, who talk about the dual labour market. In the primary market, conditions are good and the pay is high. White men dominate and can deny women and ethnic minorities responsibility and promotion due to sexism and racism. It's a little bit quick. For Barron and Norris, there is a dual labour market. In the primary market, conditions are good and pay is high. White men dominate and can deny women. And ethnic minorities responsibility and promotion due to sexism and racism. For Rex and Tomlinson, also in that section, equality legislation has made it less. So equality legislation has made it less acceptable to be openly racist, so to use racial slurs, But equality legislation has made it less acceptable to be openly racist. So ideas of racial superiority are linked to economic and cultural arguments. So equality legislation has made it less acceptable to be openly racist. So racial superiority, the argument that one group is more deserving, are linked to economic and cultural arguments. Basically, racism has become more covert. It becomes linked to cultural arguments or economic arguments about higher rates of unemployment, welfare dependency, but they're still racial and there's still a criticism of a racial group because for Rex and Tomlinson, that equality legislation has made it much more difficult, and therefore racism becomes more covert. It becomes linked to criticisms of a group due to their culture, criticisms of a group due to their economic standing, or welfare dependency if you're going to look at Saunders and black underclass. Okay, third one is Castles and Kozak, that the working class have a number of separate class subcultures. Working class, there's a number of separate class subcultures, with migrant groups being denied skill. There are a separate number of class subcultures, with migrant groups being denied skill, and are the lower group due to lacking skill sets. There are a number of different separate class subcultures, but migrant groups, remember migrants, people who move into a country to work, are often denied skill and are considered to be the lower subculture because they're often lacking skill sets or qualifications. So, this shows, largely because Barron and Norris are talking about racism, that's why it's going to become the theme of this paragraph. What I think is trickier about this question is you could arguably suggest that lacking skill or culturally racist arguments, they are racist. Sorry. Yeah. So this shows ethnic inequality is caused by racism. Shows that ethnic inequality is caused by racism. It can deny people of colour high pay. So racism can deny people of colour high pay, and therefore it lowers life expectancy and the quality of living. Ethnic inequality is caused by racism because racism is denying people of colour a higher pay. It therefore lowers their life expectancy as a group and quality of living. But interestingly, often as a group, or often as a group as people of colour, are often blamed for their own position. So it's actually racism that's denying groups of colour higher payments and therefore lower life expectancy, lower quality of living. But as a group, they're often blamed for their own position or criticised for their culture. Sorry, folks, that's my cat. He's decided to play with his cat. Okay, however, for Modude, these theorists do make generalizations about groups of colour. There may be more inequality within a specific ethnic group, e.g. South Asian groups, than between different minorities. So I'll try and explain what I mean. They're basically saying people of colour denied access to the primary market due to racism. But what Madood is saying, well, you are kind of making generalizations about whole groups of colour. There might be more inequality within a specific ethnic group like South Asian than there would be between two different groups altogether. So if you consider, for example, huge differences versus Indian students and their rate of achievement in education versus Bangladeshi and Pakistani. They're being lumped together as South Asian, but there's huge different rates of inequality between that one South Asian group than what you might find actually between, I don't know, white British and Bangladeshi, given that they've both got a similar rate of educational achievement. There are lumping together groups of colour and not recognising that there can be greater inequality within a specific ethnic group like South Asian, e.g. Indian achievement versus Bangladeshi. Greater inequality, within one ethnic group than probably between them. Bit of a confusing one, but yeah, that's the best evaluation I can offer there. However, we're going to go against, it's not racism that causes ethnic inequality. It is due to individuals' own behaviour. Or it's due to groups' own behaviour. They're not individual, they're structuralist. It's due to groups' own behaviours. So we're going to take the functionalism. So for Patterson, racism disappears as immigrants are assimilated. And eventually, discrimination will fade. Racism disappears as immigrants are assimilated, so eventually racism will fade. For Saunders, there is a black underclass developing who are welfare dependent and for Herrnstein and Murray, brace yourselves, black groups consistently have lower IQ and aptitude tests, have lower IQ and aptitude test results. They consistently perform lower on aptitude and IQ tests. So those three, short but not sweet. This shows that ethnic inequality is not caused by racism. It's caused by failure to assimilate. It's not caused by racism. It's caused by the own behaviours, the failures to assimilate, or due to people's own ability. It's not racism. It's the behaviour of individuals, their failure to assimilate due to people's own behaviours or own abilities that cause differences. I prefer the word differences. It's not racism. Own behaviours, own ability. However, this is clearly an example of covert racism. It's actually, interestingly, an example of the covert racism that Rex and Tomlinson are discussing. This is clearly an example of covert racism where stats are used to justify racist ideas, and a kind of racial superiority. And Gilbourne notes that Black peoples actually start school with one of the highest reading rates, highlighting that this theory lacks any validity. Gilbert also notes that Black peoples actually start school in some areas with one of the highest reading rates. It highlights that this theory lacks any validity. And often groups are rejected for reasons beyond their control. So again, functionalism suggesting, well, when you assimilate, racism will fade. You won't be a victim of hate crime in future if you wear different clothes and you lose your accent. But in actual fact, groups of colour are discriminated against for reasons beyond their control. How much melanin they've got in their skin tone is why they're othered or experience that horrific act of hate crime. But for the question, yep, it is racism, Weberian. No, it's not. Own behaviours, own ability. Clearly, that's very problematic. So we're going to go back for the question. Suggests that ethnic inequality is caused by racism. It is racism as well as sexism and class inequality. It is racism and sexism for intersectional feminism. So I'm going to take the two feminists there. So I've got fabulous Crenshaw, Professor Crenshaw. So there are various categories that interact and contribute towards systematic inequality. There are multiple forms of oppression so there are multiple forms of oppression, various form categories that intersect and contribute towards systematic inequality. There are multiple forms of oppression that disadvantage women of colour. For Weathers, who's with her, very similar, but for Weathers, white women face different forms of oppression to working class women of colour who have to fight racism, sexism, and class oppression. Triple disadvantage, they're all connected together. And largely, I'm going to take Mirza from the feminist grid because I like 3, and 3 is range, 3 is top band, and that's what we want for our A's and A stars. For Mirza, factors like ethnicity, culture, and religion all add to inequality, and all criticize white feminism for ignoring racism and the experiences of women of colour, because they're all rightly criticising kind of white middle class feminism. Crenshaw, various forms interact. Whether women of colour have to fight additional racism and sexism and, again, class oppression. And for Mirza, what she's really adding to the table is an understanding that certain groups, so for example, Muslim women or people who, certain cultural groups, also face those additional forms of oppression as well. Think of how rife Islamophobia is. So, 3 intersectional feminists. So this shows that ethnic inequality is caused by racism interacting with sexism and class oppression. It's all 3. This shows ethnic inequality is caused by racism interacting with sexism and class oppression to create triple forms of oppression to women, to some women. And feminist studies and studies on ethnicity both neglected to consider these women's experiences. Just kind of like the point that Crenshaw makes about how feminism didn't look at women of colour, and the civil rights movement didn't look at women of colour. So there's 2 just neglects that take place. However, this is a real struggle. So I need to try and make Shiva fit, which is a struggle here. So what I said was Shiva. However, Shiva notes that not all inequality is reduced to racism. Not all inequality is reduced to racism. Scientific and environmental thinking is dominated by the concerns of men who ignore women due to sexism rather than racism. Really trying to push that into the argument there because it's a real struggle. But what we're noting there is actually not all of the inequality can be reduced to racism or racist elements. Often women can be ignored from discussions around environmental factors, and the scientific processes tend to ignore women because they're women. It's largely around sexism rather than racism. I mean, in all honesty, it's probably a mixture of the 2 intersecting, but we need some evaluation in there to get our A. So got to make it work. So we're going to go against. Ethnic inequality is not caused by racism. It is caused, So ethnic inequality is not caused by racism, but capitalism. Ethnic inequality is not caused by racism, it's caused by capitalism. 4 Cox, for the working class are divided on ethnic lines, so cannot unite to overthrow the economic and political system that oppresses, that exploits. It's basically capitalism. While we're divided along ethnic lines, we can't unite together to overthrow the economic and political system that exploits. Can't overthrow capitalism. 4 Westergaard and Ressler. Minorities are usually found in the reserved army of labour. Ethnic minorities are usually found in the reserved army of labour. And then for Miles, people of colour form part of the main class structure, but are not accepted by others. They form part of the main class structure, but not accepted by others. So they are, groups of colour are populated within the working, middle and upper classes, but regardless of where they form in the class structure, they're often not accepted by others, again, due to racism. So what I've had to do here is I've taken Miles out of the other paragraph, because what I'm trying to do here is I'm suggesting that it's not racism that's causing ethnic inequality, it's capitalism. And it didn't quite work following that same structure. So I've had to do a little bit of playing around. So this shows that ethnic inequality is not caused by racism. It's created and maintained by the capitalist system. Ethnic inequality is not caused by racism. It's created and it's maintained by the capitalist system to exploit the labour of ethnic minorities and as a diversionary tactic to ensure profit is made from our labour. So this bit's confusing, but ultimately what we're trying to say here is the problem is not racism for Miles, Cox, Westergaard and Ressler. The problem is capitalism. It's capitalism that causes ethnic inequality. It's that system that tries to pay people of colour less money for their labour, so more profit can be made from those people's labour. And it's capitalism that uses racism to try and keep your attention away from the exploitation. Marxists these Marxists in particular would always argue the inequality is always caused by capitalism. Therefore, you remove the capitalist system, you will remove ethnic inequality. So that's why it sits on that side. It's a little bit confusing because they're still talking about racism. But again, just to stress, the inequality, all inequality for those three Marxists is caused by the capitalist system. Get rid of capitalism, you get rid of racism. Get rid of capitalism, Marxist feminists, you get rid of patriarchy. So, however, for Podolsky, and Waters, for Podolsky and Waters, class is outdated and when used is too crude and blunt an instrument. It's out of date, and when used now, it's too crude and blunt an instrument. Differences are largely due to choice or consumption. So we're criticising these Marxists by arguing you're out of date, the terms you use now are too crude and too blunt an instrument, and differences are often based around choice. So, choice or consumption. So, many may opt for 0 hours contracts. And prefer to be a reserved army of labour to try and make it connected a little bit more. It's a real struggle, this one, to keep the flow in the however. It's really quite a tricky question. So, Weberian versus functionalism and new right. Yes, it is racism and sexism for your intersectional feminism. And then we've gone against and said, no, it is caused by capitalism that's causing ethnic inequality. Okay. Lastly, what we've got left in that grid is some neo-Marxism, so some new Marxism. So when we look at the Marxists, what we note is that actually for Hall and Jefferson, they're arguing that minorities are scapegoats. They're scapegoated. Blamed by the media for social problems. So I've looked at these, so I know it goes this side, but I will explain. Minorities are scapegoated, blamed by the media for social problems caused by the inadequacies of government. Ethnic minorities are scapegoated, blamed by the media for the inadequacies of government. So high unemployment, housing. The other person left is Gilroy, who notes that actually cultural racism means that non-white groups don't see people of colour as British. And they're often, as a group, blamed for a failure to adopt British culture. So cultural racism means that non-white groups, cultural racism means that white groups don't see people of colour as British. And groups of colour are often blamed and told that there's a failure from them to adopt British culture. So white groups don't see people of colour as British. Remember I said to you before that thing, where are you from originally? So I was like, well, I was born in Birmingham. No, originally. You're like, well, my parents are from Slough. No. What you're basically asking is, why aren't you white? And what that really does is that's really suggesting, Gilroy, that that's non-white groups then don't see people of colour as British. And people of colour are often blamed for a failure. You failed to adopt British culture. Why are you speaking that language? Remember I said to you as well, if you were speaking French, and generally you weren't of colour, it would be praised as something hugely cultural and amazing. But sometimes when you're of colour or working class and you're dual heritage and you're bilingual, lots of criticism about a failure to assimilate. So those two Marxists, are left. Because I can remember Gilroy and the idea also that saturation policing, that black criminality is a widespread myth. But again, used to justify saturation policing. Kind of, again, racist procedures and policies. Just because I can remember him, and I've only got two there, I thought, well, might as well add it in. And to be fair, that is an example, again, of kind of wider racist ideas and justification. It's your failure to, as a group, not commit crime, therefore it's perfectly reasonable to be stopped and searched when you're going about your day. It's, again, blaming people for their own, blaming a group for causing their own marginalised position, when in actual fact it's often caused by racism. Hope that makes sense. Hall and Jefferson, Gilroy, those last two left, they aren't really in line with the other Marxists when I've thought about it. So the others are really suggesting, well, you are still working class, but it's often that's used, the othering of you is used to justify racism and it diverts attention. Hall and Jefferson and Gilroy are really suggesting that it seems that racism is causing inequality. It's causing groups of colour to be stopped more. It's causing groups of colour to be blamed, and that will lead to higher rates of hate crime. So these two, we're going to say this shows that racism, let's check the question. This shows that ethnic inequality is caused by racism. Ethnic inequality is caused by racism. Racist ideas are used to blame groups for social problems. Racist ideas are used to blame groups for social problems. And it leads to marginalisation from other communities and being victim to hate crime. Not capitalism that's marginalising people from other communities. It's racist ideas from media blaming people of colour for the inadequacies caused by a government by justifying saturation policing. It shows that racism gone wrong there. This shows that ethnic inequality is caused, by racism. Racist ideas are used to blame groups for social problems, and that leads to marginalisation from communities. It leads to the exclusion of groups of colour and it leads to groups being likely to be victims of hate crime. Not capitalism, it's the racism itself that leads to inequalities. However, this is arguably still a diversionary tactic. Is arguably still a diversionary tactic to blame groups for government failure. It is arguably still a diversionary tactic to blame groups for government failure. So it's arguably still a diversionary tactic to blame groups for government failure. And for Mirza, neo-Marxism fails to see how racism doesn't only disadvantage men. This strand of Marxism doesn't really consider how racism serves to not only disadvantage men. Again, quite a struggle to criticise there. I'll find them with this one. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 5 paragraphs. There's nobody left on the against side, which is why perhaps in a conclusion you might want to consider picking that it might actually be racism on that side. So in a conclusion, I would conclude, get up so I can see the question, ethnic inequality is caused by racism. Racist stereotypes. So racist stereotypes. And scapegoating. Cause minorities to be marginalised. Scapegoating causes minorities to be marginalised. It can deny higher pay and better working conditions. It can deny higher pay and better working conditions, and as a result, will lower the life expectancy. Of minority groups. Racism combined with sexism explains why so few women find themselves, explains why so few women, again of colour, find themselves in the primary market. So few women of colour find themselves in the primary market. To suggest inequality is due to own behaviour suggests that to suggest that ethnic inequality is due to own behaviour or abilities is to justify racism. So to suggest that ethnic inequality is due to their own behaviours or abilities is to justify racism. To deny, to justify racism. Yeah, due to own behaviours is to justify racism. To justify racism and to have been indoctrinated by media, scapegoating, and not holding governments to account. Because ultimately, that's my sociological view. I think from that evidence, ethnic inequality is caused by racism. I think it's what denies people better pay and working conditions. It's what denies women of colour access to primary markets. And I think to suggest that it's caused by somebody's own behaviours or abilities is to have just drank some racist Kool-Aid, to have taken it on board. And really, ultimately, what you're doing there is not holding governments to account or not being kind of open to criticising an unfair system. Because you're kind of, you're diverging your criticism. It also means you're just not open to criticising an unfair system, which is, I mean, again, disadvantaging not just people of colour, but working class, white men, women of all different groups as well. So I think it's a tricky one, which is why I've gone through it. It's got obviously the word view, debate, ethnic inequality, so I've gone straight to that grid. If you can think of another paragraph, let me know. Equally, if you can think of some better criticism, then please do let me know. Again, you will surpass me. You'll be able to improve on anything I can do as you build up to that exam. Thank you, folks. Take care.